We know that stocks, particularly in the tech industry, are going through a tough period over the past few months. Has that, I'll put this to each of you, starting with you, Jeff. Has that affected your ability to hire people? Because we know that these threats aren't going away, but perhaps a tougher hiring picture might complicate some of that. Am I wrong?
I think hiring's been really complicated for a while.
Okay.
And when there are macroeconomic conditions that affect everybody,
right.
I don't think it really affects our ability to recruit. I'm curious what my peers say. It's been hard for a while. I don't think this is making it any easier.
Yeah, from my perspective, similar to what he said, it's macroeconomic things. Security is really like a kind of secular position against any sort of trends, up or down. If you're, you need security either direction. And so I think it really comes down to, pace and speed, which definitely can have an effect. But I think in most cases, and I think for each of the companies that we work for, and I think in the spaces that we work, I think that it's going to continue to be strong. But it's a challenging environment, period, with remote work and with people taking different opportunities. And I think that's probably the larger challenge versus a macroeconomic.
Right. What do you think, Latha?
We've been lucky at Uber to have a strong pipeline of talent that want to continue to join the security and privacy program that I help oversee. I think it's interesting because while security talent has always been hard to find, there's just less people than there is demand. But one of the values that we have within Uber is great minds don't think alike, and so we really look for diversity in our hiring. And I think that's been hugely helpful. So it could be skill sets, it could be engineering, but it could be audit, compliance, software type skills, and also coming from private sector as well as public sector where there's a tremendous amount of talent. So even though there is obviously some changes happening in tech, I think with the scale of the challenges that we have at Uber, and Dar talked about it this morning in the session, I think it's still a very attractive, industry for people to get into, and then Uber because of the challenges that we have to solve, right, from an infrastructure and scale perspective.
You're also thinking about neurodiversity, like Kirsten Tye just mentioned, aren't you? Give us a sense at Uber how you're thinking about hiring a little more specifically.
Yeah, so our team is global in nature because obviously
Right.
Uber is global in nature. We operate in over 10,000 cities, so we like to be close to the communities that we're serving. So the security and privacy team is spread out quite a bit, as is the rest of Uber. And also from a skills perspective, having senior folks is very important with 10, 20 years of experience, but also recruiting from university. We have an intern program that we're doing this summer, which I'm thrilled about because that really creates a strong pipeline for us.
What are some of the threats that each of you are seeing most urgently? Is it ransomware or is it a little bit more nuanced? We'll start with you again.
Yeah, I think ransomware has not gone away. And it's still a major concern because now where, maybe 5 years ago, ransomware was something that, just kind of happened occasionally. It was very endpoint focused. Now it's something that is an enterprise that criminal organizations are focused on monetizing your inability to operate your business. It's a much bigger concern from that perspective. At the same time, I think you're also seeing it be much easier to afford executing an attack against people, even if you have MFA. So I think that's where my concern is. Like ransomware is still a concern, but it's getting cheaper to run sophisticated attacks.
What kind?
I think it is inexpensive today to bypass standard TOTP 2FA, where usually you would rely on that as like a bulletproof defense. It's getting really cheap to do that.
What about its Slack, Sean?
Well, I think in similar form, we have to look out for, threats to our application. Obviously, we're really focused at an enterprise level, to make sure that we're protecting, our enterprises who are our customers' information.
Right.
So a bit different than like the consumer side, but we still have a consumer-centric app. We want to make sure that people can use that and have the utility of that application without locking it down and making it feel like a banking application, except on the security side. So really, for us, I agree with Jeff. Definitely threats to authentication and the way that a customer reaches your application, and then ultimately the way that a customer can be assured that we have their back, and making sure that we're detecting threats and passing information on to them.
Yeah, absolutely. As the guy said, I think ransomware, unfortunately, isn't going anywhere, right? Just advanced malware and ransomware type of attacks are still very pervasive. But I think the number one thing I think about at Uber is anything that could cause business disruption for the users of our platform. To me, just with the evolution of Uber over the past 12 years, it really has become critical infrastructure. People really rely on it. And if there is any type of cyber attack that impacts that service that we're providing, I think that's paramount. Like, we would not want somebody to be stuck somewhere, because they're unable to use the service. So absolutely, ransomware, any type of data loss, IP loss is always top of mind, but also to make sure that we're able to serve, all of these customers that we have globally, I think is probably the number one cyber risk that we think about.
Can you help us illustrate when you're doing this kind of work, what does threat detection actually look like? Is someone sitting at a desk and seeing that a hacker appears to have taken over an account in Ukraine on Uber, for instance, or is a lot of this stuff automated? Is it machine learning? Let's start with Slack, Sean. I mean, what does that conversation sound like at your office?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it does start with automation. I mean, we're still, even though inside of a much larger organization now with Salesforce, we're still kind of what I would consider kind of small and punchy. And I think from us, looking at kind of an automation first strategy, but it really comes down to the people and the folks who are on the team who can actually build and train the models, build the systems. From my perspective, automation and machine learning is just a tool in our tool chest. But it really is about making sure you've got, and I think mentioned earlier, like the best and brightest diversity of talent that can help you really shape your detection strategy, then actually build those tools to provide that automation. So it ultimately does reside in get to someone at a desk, at someone's eyeballs. They have to take action, and tune the systems. But at the end of the day, we're really trying to build something broad because it has to work for all of our customers all the time.
Right. Do you agree?
Do I agree? Yeah, I think it's funny because Sean and I sort of share a lineage here. I was the original CISO at Slack, so I think I definitely believe in that. And I think where everybody is going with that is you have to build as much automation as early into the process as possible so that the automation is limiting the amount of stuff that makes it to the humans.
Okay.
Humans are fantastic decision-making machines, but they can't deal with being overloaded with information. Automation is fantastic at limiting how much information actually reaches that expensive, brilliant human that's doing the job.
Does that factor into when you're recruiting someone too? I mean, if you come work at LinkedIn, for instance, you might need to deal with fewer annoying alerts because of this automation, or am I simplifying this?
No, I think you're right. Although a slightly orthogonal answer to that is like, if you come and work at LinkedIn, you're going to be focused on hard, impactful, valuable work, and you're going to be unencumbered by all the noise and nonsense you might have to do with a less sophisticated program.
Does that make sense to you, Latha?
Yeah, I think when you sort of zoom out and you think about what's happening within any company, including Uber, there's a ton of business transformation, tech transformation, modernization that's happening, right? And so you have all kinds of, systems and databases, and it could be front end, back end type things. So at Uber, for example, Uber is powered by thousands of microservices, right? That at any given time in real time are interfacing with our users. So you're trying to log and monitor a lot of activity from all of these different things in the tech stack. But the key thing is, how do you get to the malicious behavior, right? And to do that, you do need a lot of automation, engineering. Again, going back to the diversity of hiring, that's why we hire so many software engineers. We hire folks with data experience, data engineers. So it's a mix, right? So you need, obviously, people, but you need the automation. And ultimately, the people usually behind these attacks are, it's obviously humans, right? So I don't think everything can be fully automated, but it helps reduce the noise of like, how do you go from millions of alerts that are just popping up to the key things that might really need to be actioned and responded to within a company.
Give us a sense of this idea of software supply chain security. If, say, one of LinkedIn, to pick on you as an example again, if one of your partners or an organization that you work with is hacked, how do you go about making sure that that doesn't affect your users or your ability to stay online?
Yeah, I think at LinkedIn, much like my peer organizations, it starts with a really strong supplier security program, right? So we have a dedicated team that's working on supplier security that's assessing, hey, as we bring on suppliers or software that we might use in the organization, what kind of data are we sharing with them? What is their security posture? And especially the more sensitive data that we might share with them, up to and including if it's member data or PII or something like that, if it's workforce data, we're going to want to really get into the weeds about what does your security program look like. We're going to want to have annual updates. So it starts early. You're sort of going through preventative health checkups. And then if something happens later, God forbid there's an incident, that gives us the tools to understand what's our exposure, what is their program like what's our risk, like what might be the impact of that. And who's the contact person? Like, do we already have a warm relationship with them? And I think that brings me and our executive team a lot of comfort knowing that we're probably already ahead of the game in terms of understanding how quickly we can assess the impact of that. And and I'm curious what Sean thinks with your background in incident response, but I feel like the faster you can respond to a problem, the higher the chances that it's going to have a less dramatic impact on your business and your customers.
Yeah, just jumping in on one of the things that I think is probably not specific to us, but I think as a part of how you think through that problem is you also have to know what you're using. You have to know your software composition. I mean, a lot of us have a basis on open source, even if we've worked on and forked our own projects to enhance and extend, but you still have to know that. And I think having your program have all of those component parts, whether it be that like outside-in assessment and then the inside-up assessment, I think is vitally important because it is about your ability to have the right information available to you, at the point where something occurs. Goes bump in the night, all the different parts. Does it have data? Does it have, does it have users? Does it actually have these, software components? And then you can form an action plan and actually respond effectively. But I think from at a totally zoomed out area, you need all of those to kind of be in balance. You can't just like overinvest in one part. It's not just about some automation around the application. You do have to have each of those pieces working in concert.
Yeah, I think, so many companies are still struggling with the basics of understanding the assets that they own and the systems and what devices are employees using and are they being kept up to date and secured, right? So that's one layer of it. Then I think when you get into sort of the supply chain and vendor management and whether you're using open source or just, other types of third-party integrations, it just exponentially makes the problem harder, right? Because the basics companies are still trying to catch up to. So now how do you think about vendor management and do you assess the risk of all of those vendors? And then what is sort of acceptable, right? So if the business needs a specific vendor, maybe they don't have the best security controls, would you still use them, right? Is ultimately the decision that needs to be made. So we have a very substantial third-party risk program to assess all of the vendors we use at Uber. And then, of course, there's the code, right? So within code, you have just open source, you have all these integrations and libraries. And I think the key with some of the vulnerabilities that have come out over the past year is, again, going back to that core hygiene of asset management, how quickly can you figure out what you have and get it patched and search and whatnot. So it's evolving, especially for engineering forward companies such as Uber, it's a lot of code and a lot of repositories and a lot of data, and how quickly can we sort of piece that together when there's sort of supply chain issues that occur.
You alluded to this. Kirsten Todd mentioned it a few minutes ago. For anyone who doesn't know, Log4j is an open source software library that a lot of tech companies, I don't know about the three of you, use it to build all kinds of tools. There was a big vulnerability in it that was discovered last year. And it could give hackers all kinds of deep access into affected systems. Has that incident, which has created all kinds of consternation, obviously, convinced you to change anything that you do in terms of open source security, or are any of you rethinking any behaviors that you may have had in place previously?
I know we're not rethinking anything directly as a result of that incident, but I know for us, and I'm sure for a lot of companies, we're investing and doubling down on making sure that we understand what's in everything that we use, right? Having good asset management and having a good point of contact for that piece of software. So in a really high scale environment, we have a little bit of everything in that environment. That's what happened to Log4j. Everybody had it. It just took a lot of companies a lot of time to realize, oh, yeah, we have this too. So we're working even harder to make sure that that is easier to respond to the next time something like that happens, which I think is a really natural reaction.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the asset management side is a huge part of it. And, whether you responded well, and I think I'm very proud of the response that we had during that event. The challenge is how do you maintain that all the time, right? It can't just be just when that happens and with that particular piece of software. And so I think, asset management, while it's always listed at like one of the core controls, the thing that everyone needs, it's also one of the most challenging because it's a business problem like access and other things. So I think that is a perennial investment that may not be on the threat detection side talking about adversaries, but it really is because you have to know what you're protecting. And that I think brought that to stark relief with people who might say, asset management or those tools or that capability is maybe more boring than your threat detection automation. It's actually not. You can train models on your infrastructure. You can actually look at the roles that they form and what they're used for, and really think through how you're going to provide that information quickly to your own team so they can respond.
I take your point. Maybe it's not as sensational as like, oh, Chinese hackers are doing this now. It's like, oh, but here's a way that they actually could get in, right?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Kirsten also mentioned the idea of breach notification, how that's evolving, this trust between the government and companies like yours. Are there incentives for communicating with DHS or FBI or other government agencies when it's not legally required? It doesn't even need to be a breach notification. I'm not sure if you're sharing information about the kinds of things you're seeing among hacking groups or different kinds of threats. Are those conversations happening? Should they? Where does that stand?
Yeah, I think the partnership between the public sector and private sector is incredibly critical. And I think we saw that just in the past 24 hours. There were some notifications helping guide companies, right, such as Uber, of potential, adversaries and some techniques that were happening within the telco space. And the government issued a number of notifications yesterday. So I think that partnership is really critical. And I think in terms of breach notification, obviously this whole space, depending on the industry you're in and the countries you operate in, is highly regulated and watched closely. And I think it's something we stay very close with, just on the security side, privacy side, legal policy side, globally, just to make sure we meet any of those requirements, which are ever changing, by the way, in terms of what you need to notify, when you need to notify, how you need to notify it, right? So I do think that's evolving. But the key thing, I think I can speak for the guys, is if there is an issue, how you respond and making sure you're transparent both within the company as well as with ultimately any users that are impacted.
No, nothing to.
No, I think CIS is doing an amazing job. I think all of us have lived through the last decade plus of it being really hard to share with the government in general, just logistically hard to do. And then just suffering from, you didn't get anything back. Like you would never get anything unless God forbid somebody knocks on your door and says like, hey, you're breached, right. Which is not the relationship you want to have with the federal government. But I think now, we're seeing the beginning of a different time where like recently FBI was doing briefings with people to sort of brief them on the Lapis stuff. CISA has been sharing indicators and being outbound and really engaging the private community in a really positive way. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited for seeing some regulatory and legislative changes as well that enable companies to share even more data so that we can all understand how breaches happen, how a recent breach might have happened in another company, and all learn from that and be able to prevent it at your own organization.
What is the so I gather it's helpful to have threat information, it sounds like, from them. What is the trick when it comes to the amount of time that you can actually act on that? Is it happening fast enough? Where is something that we might look for improvement, for instance, with that process?
Yeah, I think it goes back to our earlier conversation about monitoring and automation, is that when the government does, it's usually called indicators of compromise, or IOCs. They'll say, kind of, here are the 10 fingerprints that hackers were, sort of left behind that maybe you should search your company, environment for, right? So in terms of speed, I think, again, as Jeff mentioned, they've been very proactive, which is awesome, to get that intelligence into the hands of folks like us. Then it's up to us to go search our environments, right? And so then it comes down to, what is the the technology stack you have and the automation and skills, and how quickly can you do that?
And there's definitely a balance between speed and accuracy.
Sure.
That we face, and getting a lot of information that's inaccurate to go hunt through your environment thinking it's that important is also not as helpful as something that you know and receive and know that there's true positive, maybe even, against something that you own. But it really comes down to, is it helping you defend your customers? Is it really something that you can action, and that from a company perspective that you can ingest in a way? And so I think that's where I agree with Jeff. The things that are going to be set up by having the government be more open to a method of sharing will create the networks and the required mechanisms to share, so it's not a surprise.
Right.
And then you can action a lot faster because you're receiving them through defined channels, and you're able to action and then share what's occurred with your customers.
I know that each of your jobs involves a lot more than making sure that things aren't stolen or hacked, and I hope you can give us a sense with just a couple minutes left, to what extent you're thinking about navigating different regulatory environments. Obviously, LinkedIn pulled out of China last year, toward the end of last year, and how much different expectations of different governments are on each of your priority lists.
I think, certainly for LinkedIn's business, anytime you operate a global scale service where you're connecting people to economic opportunity in lots of different areas, you're always going to be looking at what is the regulatory burden to make sure that you are balancing the equities between providing that critical high impact service to people that really need it, and then what it takes to make sure that you can protect their privacy, keep their data secure, operate your business effectively in a different regulatory market. I think it's certainly challenging because globally, there's no homogeneity to those regulatory requirements.
Yeah, and I think from the perspective of, it's all about the data, depending on the product. But, from the perspective for us, we would be thinking about how do we protect this information and, keep it resident where the customer expects. That's probably something they may have paid for, and that we have to assure that. And so that's an entirely different regulatory environment than maybe another country, another location in the world. And that's an extremely challenging proposition for us. But I like that nexus of security being at the forefront of really helping, shape that and protect that information regardless of location.
Yeah, I think it's a security discussion with regulators, but it really is more about privacy and data governance.
Right.
And some of the regulators now requiring encryption, for example, depending on the different countries. So I think it's evolving. I think the key thing is to make sure we're transparent with our users on what we're doing, as well as continue to try to meet those regulatory obligations. Because in the case of Uber, we do need that relationship and those approvals to get licenses in all of the different markets we operate in.